Psychology says some children don't lose their childhood suddenly. They outgrow it quietly, like clothes that stop fitting without anyone noticing. No one announces the transition. There's no ceremony. They just wake up one day and realize someone needs to be the adult in the room, and it might as well be them. This is the psychology of a child who grew up too fast. Here's what makes this fascinating. Most people who experience this can't pinpoint exactly when it happened. There was no specific moment childhood ended. Instead, it dissolved gradually, replaced by something heavier, something unspoken. They remember being 7 and knowing which bills were overdue, being 9 and settling arguments between adults, being 11 and feeling responsible if their mother cried, being 13 and already exhausted. But here's the question psychology has been investigating for decades. What actually happens inside a developing brain when adult responsibilities arrive before childhood is finished? And why do the effects show up so predictably in adulthood, often in people who never made the connection? The pattern is remarkably consistent. Adults who grew up too fast describe similar experiences. Difficulty relaxing without guilt, relationships where they're always the caretaker, an inability to ask for help, and a constant low-level hum of responsibility for things that aren't actually their fault. So what's happening beneath the surface? In the 1970s, a family therapist named Ivan Bosomenyi Nagy gave this pattern a name: parentification. It's a role reversal where the child becomes the functional parent, and the parent becomes someone who needs parenting. Parentification isn't about doing chores. Most children help around the house. This is something different. It's about carrying emotional or practical weight that's beyond what a child's age can handle. It's a responsibility without the mental or emotional tools to process it properly. Psychology shows us that human beings move through predictable stages as they grow. Each stage builds a foundation, learning to trust, becoming independent, taking initiative, and feeling capable. When a child is thrust into adult roles too early, they don't skip these stages cleanly. Instead, they bury them. The needs tied to those stages. The need to be cared for, to play without purpose, to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. Those needs don't disappear. They go underground. And they resurface later, often disguised as anxiety, perfectionism, or an inability to receive care without immediately giving it back. A psychologist named Donald Winnicott called what develops in these children the false self. It's a well-behaved, super competent identity built to stabilize an unstable environment. The true self, the one with needs and vulnerabilities, learns to stay hidden because expressing it historically made things worse. Psychologists distinguish two main forms of parentification, and they create different but overlapping effects. The first is instrumental parentification. This is practical, visible. The child cooks meals for the family, takes care of younger siblings, handles money, cleans the house, works to help pay bills. This often happens in families affected by poverty, illness, divorce, or the stress of moving to a new country. The responsibilities are real, concrete, and often recognized by others. The second is emotional parentification, and this one is more hidden because it's invisible. The child becomes the parent's therapist, the one who listens to adult problems, the peacemaker in conflicts, the one who manages everyone else's emotions. A parent might confide in them about relationship struggles, money fears, or personal disappointments. Things no child is equipped to carry. Sometimes this shows up as what researchers call spouseification, where the child essentially fills a partner-like emotional role for the parent. They become the confidant, the emotional support, the one the parent leans on. In both cases, the child learns the same core lesson. My value comes from being useful, not from being cared for. And here's what makes this particularly complicated. Parentification rarely comes from cruelty. Most parents who parentify their children aren't intentionally harmful. They're overwhelmed, lacking resources, dealing with mental illness, carrying their own trauma, or emotionally immature themselves. Often they were parentified in their own childhoods and are unconsciously repeating the only model they know. But impact doesn't require intention. So what happens in the brain when a 7-year-old is managing emotional crises or a 10-year-old is functioning as the household organizer? The brain adapts. That's what brains do. But the adaptation comes at a cost. Children in these environments develop hypervigilance. Their brain's threat detection system becomes extraordinarily sensitive. They learn to scan faces for tiny expressions, to detect shifts in tone, to anticipate problems before they fully form. This isn't a conscious skill, it's a survival mechanism. As adults, they often describe an uncanny ability to read rooms, to sense when someone is upset before that person even speaks. It sounds like a strength, and in some contexts it is, but it's also exhausting. Because hypervigilance doesn't turn off. The nervous system never fully rests. Constant activation of the stress response system means elevated cortisol, the hormone released during perceived threat. In childhood, when the brain is still developing, prolonged cortisol exposure can affect memory, emotional balance, and decision making. The result? These children often become exceptionally capable, but internally, they're running on a stress response system that was never designed to be always on. And because they learned early that their own emotional needs created more chaos, they developed what's sometimes called emotional suppression. Crying felt dangerous, anger was too risky. Even excitement could be threatening if it had been historically interrupted or punished. Over time, they become strangers to their own inner world. Many describe feeling numb, flat, or disconnected from their emotions. Not because they lack feelings, but because they learned to mute them so effectively that accessing them now feels nearly impossible. Here's one of the most telling patterns. Adults who grew up too fast often cannot rest without guilt. Vacations feel stressful. Hobbies feel indulgent. Sitting down to watch something without multitasking feels wrong. There's an internal voice, often internalized from a stressed or a critical parent, and that insists productivity is the only acceptable state. Psychology explains this through learned association. In their childhood, calm often came before chaos. When things were quiet, that's when something usually went wrong. The nervous system learned to link peace with danger, rest with neglect. So even in adulthood, when objectively safe, the body remains alert. Doing nothing triggers a low-grade anxiety because the subconscious is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Play, the primary psychological work of childhood, becomes almost inaccessible. Play is where children learn to take risks in a low-stakes environment, to be messy, to imagine, to fail without consequence. When that stage gets skipped, adults often struggle to engage in activities purely for enjoyment. They describe feeling like they've forgotten how to have fun, or they turn fun into achievement, rest into optimization. The idea of doing something with no purpose, no outcome, no productivity feels destabilizing. This is not a personality flaw. It's an adaptation to an environment where rest was a luxury they couldn't afford and usefulness was the price of safety. Parentified children carry a blueprint into adulthood, and it shapes every relationship they enter. The blueprint says love equals service. Connection requires usefulness. To be needed is to be safe. So they gravitate toward people who need help, partners who are struggling, friends who are in crisis. They become the person everyone calls when things fall apart. And on the surface, this looks like kindness, even strength. But underneath, it's often a compulsion born from the belief that they're only valuable when they're fixing something. This is the root of codependency. Not the pop psychology version, but the clinical pattern where self-worth is entirely dependent on being needed by others. Receiving care, however, feels unbearable. When someone offers support without expecting anything in return, it can trigger discomfort, suspicion, or even shame. Because the internal narrative is, if someone is taking care of me, I'm burdening them. I'm taking the resources they need. I'm being selfish. Research on attachment shows that parentified children often develop either anxious or avoidant attachment styles. Anxious because they learned early that the connection is unstable and must be earned through performance. Avoidant, ansekis tanis, ada, because they learned that depending on anyone leads to disappointment, so they shut down emotionally before anyone can let them down. Many describe a push-pull dynamic in relationships. They desperately want intimacy, but simultaneously do everything possible to prevent it. Because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like losing control, and control was the only thing that kept their childhood world from collapsing. True intimacy means letting someone see you when you're not being useful, when you're tired, confused, and needy. And for someone whose survival once depended on being the strong one, that exposure feels catastrophic. So if this is the pattern, what does recovery look like? First, it starts with naming it. Many people go decades without realizing their childhood was structured this way. They just thought they were responsible, mature, and independent. The realization often comes in therapy, sometimes in a conversation, sometimes while watching content exactly like this. Healing doesn't mean rejecting the strengths that have developed. Parentified children often become deeply empathetic, perceptive, resourceful adults. Those qualities are real, but healing means learning to hold those strengths without needing them to justify your existence. One of the most important steps is grief. Grieving the childhood that didn't happen. This is difficult because it can feel self-indulgent or disloyal to parents who were doing their best. But grief isn't to blame. It's an acknowledgement. It's saying something was lost, and that loss mattered. Therapy, particularly approaches designed for trauma like internal family systems, EMDR, or body-based therapy, helps people access and care for the parts of themselves that froze at the age the wound occurred, because those parts didn't age. The 7-year-old who needed comfort is still there, waiting. Reparenting means learning to give yourself the attention you didn't receive. It means practicing self-compassion when you make mistakes. It means allowing yourself to rest without earning it first. Setting boundaries is perhaps the most radical act. learning to say no, to disappoint someone without it feeling like the end of the world, to ask for help, to let someone else carry the weight without immediately trying to take it back. And perhaps most difficult, learning to tolerate dependency, to let people show up for you, to resist the reflex to minimize your needs or immediately give back, to sit with the discomfort of being cared for until it starts to feel less dangerous. This isn't a quick process. It's often slow, non-linear, and frustrating. But it's also deeply worth it. The child who grew up too fast did what they had to do to survive. That child was resourceful, perceptive, and strong in ways most people never have to be. But survival mode was never meant to be permanent. Psychology doesn't say you're broken. It says your nervous system adapted brilliantly to an environment that asked too much. You learned responsibility before you learned safety, competence before you learned to receive care, strength before you understood that softness isn't weakness. And healing doesn't mean unlearning all of that. It means adding what was missing. Permission to need, permission to rest, permission to be cared for not because you've earned it, but simply because you exist. If you recognize yourself in this, know that thousands of others did too. The weight you've been carrying wasn't yours to begin with. And slowly, carefully, you can start setting it down. You don't have to be the adult in every room anymore. You're allowed to just be.